Howl at midnight. A wolf shifter cursed to remain in wolf form after sunset finds love with a night shift nurse. Every evening she tends his injuries, but as the bond deepens, she wonders if she loves the man or the beast he becomes. Before we begin our story, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more like this. And now for Howl at midnight. The moon hung low over Pine Hollow, a pale coin rolling across a velvet sky. In the hush of midnight, the forest breathed soft rustles of leaves, distant water whispering over stones, and Dorian staggered through it, bleeding into the snow. The gash on his flank burned like fire. His breath fogged in ragged bursts as he limped between pines, the curse already gnawing at the edges of his mind. Sunset had stolen his human form hours ago, trapping him in fur and claws until dawn. He paused near the tree-line, golden eyes scanning the sleepy lights of the town below. A clinic sign glowed faintly at the edge of Main Street. He'd never dared this close to humans before. But the pain was sharp, and the memory of fangs flashing in the dark rogue wolves, hungry for blood, pushed him forward. Down the hill, fluorescent light spilled from the clinic's side door. Elena Rivera wiped her hands on her scrub pants, savoring a moment of quiet. The night shift was usually all twisted ankles and chest colds, but she'd been restless tonight, as if the dark carried secrets just beyond the walls. The faint scrape of claws on asphalt made her stiffen. She stepped outside, her breath catching in the winter air. A massive wolf stood in the parking lot's glow, fur-matted and streaked with blood. Its eyes, strangely intelligent, almost pleading, locked on hers. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice barely more than a trembling breath. The wolf lowered himself onto the pavement, exposing the wound as if offering trust. Elena's heart pounded. "What are you doing?" She muttered to herself, kneeling beside the creature. She pressed gauze to the gash, marveling at the heat beneath his fur. The wolf didn't growl. Instead, he sighed, a sound far too human, and for a moment she swore she saw gratitude flicker in those golden eyes. Far above them, the moon sailed on, silent witness to the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. She moved with calm economy, propping the side door with her hip, coaxing him inside with a low, steady murmur. Antiseptic drifted from the dim hallway, lights flickering as if the building itself were drowsy. He followed, paws slipping on linoleum, pried a crumpled thing under the need to survive. On the exam table, Elena worked quickly saline flush, gauze, a stack of sterile packs. "You're enormous," she breathed, more awe than fear. "If animal control shows up, they'll cart you off to some underfunded nightmare. So let's keep this between us, yeah?" Her gloved fingers explored the wound, the touch firm and sure. He flinched once, and she paused. "I know. I'm sorry. You're safe." Dorian focused on her voice to keep the beast's instincts from snapping free. The curse dulled language into shapes and flavors, but feeling cut through fine, the care in her tone, the heat of her hands, the bright pulse of her concern. When she threaded a needle, her brow pinched in concentration. When she set the first stitch, her breath hitched in sympathy. "You poor thing," she murmured. "Who did this to you?" He wanted to answer, to explain the rogues and the way hunger warps a pack into something feral. Instead, he let the quiet carry what words couldn't. He held still. She finished the sutures with neat confidence, then wrapped the flank. "There," she said, lips curving at one corner. "You're going to live to terrorize more garbage cans." He huffed, a startled sound that earned a soft laugh. The clock ticked toward 1 a.m. Elena fetched a bowl of water and slid it close. "Drink." He did, and her smile deepened, weary and pleased. "I'm Elena, by the way. Night shift goblin, patron saint of bad decisions." She leaned against the counter, studying him with frank curiosity. "You've got old eyes. Like you've seen more winter than your fur says." The door chime thunked faintly out front. A patient shuffled, coughed, left. When silence returned, she lowered the blinds and dimmed the lights to a muted halo. "I can't keep you," she said, "but I can sit a while." She pulled up a stool and, as though confessing to a priest, began to talk. She told him about the quiet after midnight, the way the town's emergencies softened into loneliness. How her father's heart had failed between visiting hours when she was 19. How she'd chosen nights because the dark was honest, no pretense, just need. As she spoke, her voice smoothed, unspooling threads of a life stitched by small kindnesses and stubbornness. Dorian listened, still as snowfall. The ache in his side throbbed less under her presence. The curse had given him many nights to learn what people were when they thought no one was listening. Elena's honesty felt like warm tea against cold hands. Near 3, she dozed in the stool, chin tipped to her chest. He watched the delicate flutter of her pulse at her throat, the stray curl that tickled her cheek. A reckless tenderness rose in him, startling as lightning, the urge to rest a heavy head in her lap, to be a thing she could trust. He didn't move. He waited until the first thin gray of dawn seeped through the blinds, until his bones began their familiar grind back toward human. Panic sparked. If she woke and saw no. He slid from the table with careful, silent control, leaving a single hair snagged on the edge of her glove and a faint, grateful rumble in the air. Dorian eased the side door shut behind him, paused silent on the frost-bitten ground. The first blue-gray streaks of dawn crept over Pine Hollow's treetops, and the ache in his bones warned of the change. He limped toward the shadowed woods, each step a countdown to sunrise. By the time the sun crested the horizon, heat lanced through him, fur receding, claws curling into fingers, the world expanding into sharper angles. He crouched naked among the ferns, breath fogging the chill morning air, cursing the witch who had bound him to this nightly prison. He pressed a hand to his stitched flank and felt the rough pull of Elena's careful work. Her scent, soap, antiseptic, and something warmer, clung to him. Back at the clinic, Elena woke with a start. The stool was empty, the exam table stripped bare, but for a single tuft of gray fur caught on the glove she'd worn. For a dizzy moment she wondered if she'd dreamed the entire encounter. But the faint paw print on the paper sheet said otherwise. All through her shift's final hours, her thoughts wandered. She'd felt something uncanny in the wolf's gaze, a sense that he'd understood her words. She replayed the way he'd sighed under her hands, how the moment had felt strangely human. By mid-morning, fatigue tugged at her eyelids, but instead of going straight home, she stopped by Pine Hollow Supply for coffee and a few groceries. The shop's bell jingled as she stepped inside, the scent of fresh bread mingling with sawdust and leather. She reached for a carton of milk just as another hand brushed hers. She looked up into storm-gray eyes framed by a day's worth of stubble. The man before her, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better days, pulled his hand back with a quick, apologetic smile. "Sorry," he said, voice deep but a little rough as though he hadn't used it much. "Didn't mean to startle you." Something about him snagged at her memory. The color of his eyes, too familiar, too striking. Elena blinked, suddenly aware of her pounding heart. "No problem," she managed, tucking the carton under her arm. He reached for a bag of flour, moving with a careful grace that made her think of last night's wounded wolf. The same quiet watchfulness. The same unspoken weight. She pushed the thought aside, ridiculous. Wolves didn't turn into men. But as she left the shop, she glanced back once, catching him watching her. Not leering, just studying her, as if she were something precious he couldn't quite believe was real. Outside, snow began to fall, flakes spinning lazily against the morning light. Elena pulled her coat tighter, wondering why a stranger's gray eyes felt like moonlight on her skin, and why she couldn't shake the sense she'd known him before. Dorian lingered by the shop window after she left, pretending to study a display of canned goods while his heart thudded like distant thunder. Seeing her in daylight, without the clinic's dim glow or the smell of blood, was a dangerous kind of sweetness. He'd promised himself not to get close to humans, not again. But the memory of her hands steadying his trembling body had already rewritten his resolve. He paid for his flour and coffee beans, nodded politely to the cashier, and stepped out into the brisk air. Snowflakes dusted his hair and shoulders. Across the street, Elena stood beneath a lamppost, rummaging in her bag for her keys. She glanced up, caught him watching, and rather than looking away, offered the faintest of smiles before heading for her car. By evening, Elena sat curled on her couch, a mug of tea cradled between her palms. Her apartment was small but warm, mismatched throw pillows, stacks of nursing textbooks beside a dying succulent. She'd told herself she'd sleep early, but the wolf's golden eyes haunted her. She kept wondering why she'd whispered her father's story to him, why it had felt natural to unburden herself to a creature that shouldn't have understood. And then there was the man at the supply store, those storm gray eyes, that quiet presence. She shook her head, setting the mug down. "You're overtired," she muttered. "You're imagining connections where there aren't any." But the thrill lingering in her chest said otherwise. When the sun dipped behind Pine Hollow's ridge, Dorian stood at the forest's edge, fingers tightening around his jacket zipper. He hated this part, the tug in his gut, the brittle snap of bones reforming. He crouched as the curse took hold, for rippling outward, the world sharpening into scent and sound. Snow squeaked beneath his paws. The night air carried her scent, faint traces of tea and lavender detergent drifting from the town. Against all sense, his paws carried him back toward civilization. Near midnight, Elena's phone buzzed, an emergency call from the clinic. She threw on her coat, tugged boots over wool socks, and drove through gently falling snow. The parking lot was empty, the clinic dark except for the glow of the side door she'd left unlocked out of habit. As she stepped inside, a soft shuffle reached her ears. She turned, half expecting a patient. Instead, golden eyes gleamed in the shadows, so familiar her breath caught. The wounded wolf limped into the light, bandaged flank holding. Relief surged through her, banishing doubt. "You came back," she whispered, the words trembling with wonder. She knelt, hand outstretched. The wolf approached, pressing his massive head into her palm. A strange, joyful ache blossomed in her chest. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the world. Inside the clinic, something fragile and extraordinary began to weave itself between woman and beast, thread by thread, under the silent blessing of the winter moon. Elena closed the door behind her, shutting out the wind's lonely whistle. The clinic's fluorescent light flickered once, then steadied, washing the room in a pale glow. The wolf's breath fogged the air as he followed her to the exam room, paws silent on the tile. His bandaged flank bore her handiwork, the stitches holding neatly. Relief warmed her. He had survived the night, the forest, and whatever had chased him. "You're a stubborn one," she murmured, crouching to meet his gaze. Most wild animals would have disappeared after the first chance to run. He lowered himself onto the table with surprising gentleness. The muscles in his shoulders shifted under fur the color of storm clouds. Elena's fingers brushed the bandage as she checked for bleeding. The wolf flinched, then relaxed. "You heal fast," she said, tracing the edge of the dressing. "Must be good genetics. Or good luck." She caught herself smiling at him like he understood. It wasn't just wishful thinking, there was something in those eyes, some steady intelligence that made her chest ache. The wolf exhaled, a low, almost satisfied rumble. Elena laughed softly. "Don't go making me believe in magic, okay?" She spoke to him while she worked, stories about the small-town chaos of Pine Hollow, about the older nurse who'd taught her the perfect suture knot, about the time she'd been snowed in at the clinic for 3 days and eaten nothing but saltines and ginger ale. The wolf watched her with a calm attentiveness that made her forget the hour. When she finally taped a fresh bandage over the wound, she noticed her hands had stopped trembling. His presence steadied her. She stroked behind his ear, and the wolf leaned into the touch, eyes closing briefly. The intimacy of the gesture startled her, a fragile, dangerous tenderness sparking to life. Snowflakes pattered against the window like whispered secrets. Elena sat beside him on the floor, back against the counter, sipping cold coffee and talking about the constellations she sometimes glimpsed on her smoke breaks. She told him how she'd once wanted to be an astronomer before life pushed her into nursing, and how lately she felt like she was drifting without a plan. The wolf shifted closer, resting his chin on her knee. Her heart thudded in her chest. She let her fingers slide over the coarse fur along his neck, marveling at the heat beneath. Minutes stretched into an hour, the world outside shrinking to the quiet hum of the clinic and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Eventually, her eyelids drooped. "I'll just rest a second," she mumbled, slumping slightly. When her head nodded forward, the wolf stayed still, unwilling to disturb her. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, memorizing the soft curve of her mouth, the steady scent of her kindness. For the first time in years, the gnawing loneliness of his curse loosened its grip. But dawn crept closer. He felt the familiar pull, the world tilting, magic coiling tight. He eased himself off the table, paws barely whispering on the tile. One last look at Elena, her hair a dark halo against the sterile clinic floor, and he slipped out the side door, snow swallowing his tracks. As the horizon blushed with sunrise, bones broke and reformed, fur receded, and Dorian gasped into human lungs once more. He stood in the sheltering pines, clutching his side where her stitches held, and whispered to the morning, "You shouldn't matter this much." Yet she already did. The sun was a pale, washed-out disk when Elena finally stirred. Her neck ached from sleeping upright against the counter, and a faint chill clung to the clinic air. She blinked groggily and turned toward the exam table empty. The bandage wrappers lay neatly in the trash, the floor bore no muddy paw prints, and only a single coarse gray hair remained snagged on the edge of her stool. She pressed her palm against the empty space, feeling foolish for the pang of disappointment. "Guess you're not much for goodbyes," she murmured. But her chest was too light for regret. It felt more like hope. All through the morning, she replayed the night. The way the wolf's head had rested on her knee. The warmth of his breath. The impossible familiarity in his eyes. She told herself she'd hallucinated half of it, that fatigue and a double shift had bent reality. Still, she found herself glancing toward the tree lean on her drive home, scanning for movement among the frosted pines. Dorian spent the day wrapped in shadows beneath a hunter's cabin deep in the woods. The scent of Elena lingered on his skin, faint and intoxicating. He tried chopping firewood, tried fishing the half-frozen stream, anything to keep his mind from returning to her touch. But each task unraveled under memory. He'd kept himself apart for years, convinced isolation was safer for everyone. But Elena's voice had slipped past his defenses like moonlight through broken shutters. By late afternoon, he crafted a flimsy excuse to go into town. Supplies. Coffee beans. Bandages. Anything. But what he really wanted was a glimpse of her in daylight, proof she was real. The bell over Pine Hollow Supply jingled as Elena stepped inside, clutching a shopping list and telling herself she wasn't hoping to see anyone in particular. The familiar smell of roasted coffee and pine cleaner enveloped her. She reached for a carton of milk, distracted by thoughts of her mysterious patient, when a warm voice brushed her ear. "Careful, got it." The carton slipped slightly, and a strong hand steadied hers. She turned, breath catching. The man before her was broad-shouldered, his hair dark and unruly, eyes a stormy gray that tugged at some instinctual place inside her. "Sorry," he said, releasing the carton with a small, apologetic smile. His voice was deep, worn at the edges like a favorite record. "Didn't mean to startle you." Elena stared a fraction too long. Something in his gaze, steady, searching, reminded her of golden eyes under moonlight. She forced a laugh. "It's fine. Long night shift." "Dorian," he offered, shifting the bag of flour under his arm. "Just passing through, picking up a few things." She nodded, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Elena, I work at the clinic." "Nice place," he said lightly, though the corner of his mouth twitched as if the words carried a private joke. They shared a silence that felt anything but awkward. Then a customer coughed near the counter, breaking the moment. Dorian tipped his head in a small farewell and moved to pay, leaving Elena standing in the aisle with a heart that beat a little too fast. Outside, snow drifted lazily down Main Street. Elena watched him through the window as he stepped into the white swirl, his flannel shirt dusted with flakes. Something in her bones whispered a truth her mind wasn't ready to accept, that she'd met this man before, even if the how of it made no sense at all. The snowfall thickened, cloaking Pine Hollow in white silence as Elena stepped out of the shop. She spotted Dorian ahead, shoulders hunched against the wind, and for a heartbeat she considered calling after him, some flimsy excuse about forgetting to ask which road he lived on or whether he'd found decent coffee beans in this backwater town. But the word stuck. She wasn't sure why it mattered so much that a stranger's gray eyes lingered in her mind. On the drive home, every snow-burdened tree seemed touched by enchantment, and Elena felt the echo of that impossible night, the warmth of a wolf's head on her knee, woven into the falling flakes. At home, she set down her groceries and stared out her window toward the forest edge, where the dark boughs met the pale sky. Something was out there, watching, waiting. She felt it not as fear but as anticipation. By dusk, Dorian stood at the threshold of his cabin, listening to the winter hush. The forest was a cathedral of ice-draped branches, each creak and whisper an old hymn. He pulled on his jacket, knowing he should stay hidden. Yet the curse would force a shift soon, and the wolf in him had already chosen its path. It would run, not away, but toward her. The change came like a fist to the gut, bones cracking, muscles twisting, vision sharpening. He exhaled a cloud of breath, for bristling against the cold, and padded down the slope toward town. The scent of Elena soap, tea, the faint trace of her skin, pulled him onward. At the clinic, the lights were dim, a single lamp glowing in the front office. Elena sat at the reception desk, rubbing her eyes, paperwork scattered around her. She jumped slightly when a shadow crossed the frosted glass door. Then she saw him, the wolf, silver-gray and magnificent against the falling snow. He stood utterly still, his golden gaze fixed on her. "You're unbelievable," she whispered, slipping on her coat and boots. She opened the door cautiously. "If anyone else sees you, you'll end up on the front page of the Pine Hollow Gazette." The wolf stepped closer, breath pluming in the frigid air. Elena crouched, holding out her gloved hand. "You came back," she said softly, as though speaking it might make it true. He nudged his muzzle against her palm. The contact sent a shock through her, sharp and tender. For a long moment, neither moved, woman and beast, snow swirling around them like a blessing. Inside, she guided him to the exam room again, but there was no wound to tend tonight, only the warmth of silent company. She pulled a stool beside him and, emboldened by the quiet, confessed stories she hadn't told anyone in years. The dream of leaving Pine Hollow for the city, her fear of being ordinary. The ache that settled in her chest when she thought of her father's unfinished stargazing journal. The wolf listened, head tilted, ears flicking at her voice. His steady presence wrapped around her like a cloak. She realized she was no longer talking to fill the silence, she was talking because she wanted him to know her. Outside, the moon rose higher, spilling silver light across the snow, and something fragile but undeniable rooted itself between them. Neither of them yet dared to name it. Hours slipped by beneath the hum of the clinic's old radiator. Elena sat cross-legged on the tile, her back against the counter. The wolf sprawled beside her like a living shadow. The snow's reflection painted soft patterns on the walls. She'd stopped checking the clock, time felt suspended in the quiet of his breathing. "You're going to ruin me for normal pets," she whispered, tracing a finger along the edge of his ear. "Some poor dog's going to look at me funny, and I'll expect him to listen to my existential crises." The wolf exhaled a low huff, almost a laugh. She startled, then smiled. "See? You were listening." She spoke about her mother's postcards from cities she never visited, about the scholarship she'd once declined because she couldn't leave her ailing father, about how sometimes she wished someone would see her as more than the reliable night nurse. The wolf's golden eyes didn't flinch from her honesty. In them, she felt understood in a way she hadn't in years. When her words dwindled, the only sounds were the radiator's hiss and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Elena's eyelids grew heavy. She leaned sideways, her shoulder brushing warm fur. The wolf stayed perfectly still, careful not to wake her. But the world outside the clinic wasn't still. A distant howl sliced the night, rogue wolves, their cries jagged and hungry. Dorian's ears pricked. He stiffened, torn between instinct and the fragile peace in the room. He couldn't risk drawing the rogues to her doorstep, not tonight. As the sky lightened toward dawn's steel-blue edge, magic stirred in his veins. The curse preparing to drag him back to human form. Carefully, he eased away from Elena's sleeping form, paused soundless on the tile. He lingered at the doorway for a heartbeat, golden eyes lingering on her face softened by sleep. Then he slipped outside into the brittle cold, leaving only paw prints in the fresh snow. Sunrise burned away the forest shadows as Dorian collapsed behind a stand of pines, the shift wrenching through his body. He gritted his teeth against the pain, curling against the icy ground until fingers replaced paws. The wound Elena had stitched pulled but held strong. He dressed quickly, breath steaming, and stared toward Pine Hollow. She was becoming more than a kind stranger. She was becoming dangerous to him, dangerous in the way hope always was. Elena awoke on the clinic floor to a beam of sunlight cutting across the room. The wolf was gone again. But the memory of his steady warmth lingered, and something inside her felt irreversibly altered. Driving home later, she spotted a lone figure crossing Main Street, a tall man with dark hair, moving with the same measured grace she'd seen in the wolf. For a moment, her breath caught. She almost pulled over, almost called out. But reason reasserted itself. Wolves weren't men. Fairy tales were for other people. And yet, her fingers tightened on the steering wheel, her heart betraying her with a thrum of recognition. Somewhere deep down, she already knew she would see him again. Dorian spent the day pacing the cabin's creaking floorboards, every plank groaning beneath his restless steps. He'd sworn after the witch's curse that he'd never let another human close, too dangerous, too cruel when the truth surfaced. But Elena's voice kept echoing in his mind, warm, unpretentious, achingly human. She'd trusted a wounded beast without hesitation. He had no right to seek her out again, yet the thought of staying away felt like choking. By late afternoon, he gave up pretending. He shaved, changed into a clean flannel and worn jeans, and forced himself to concoct a reason to wander into town tools for cabin repairs. He told himself. A harmless errand. Nothing to do with her. Elena sat at a corner table in the Pine Hollow Cafe, her shift finally over. Steam curled from her mug of chamomile tea, and she stared at the starlight fracturing through frost on the window. She'd told herself she was just grabbing tea to warm up on her walk home, but part of her, traitorous and insistent, watched the door every time the bell chimed. The bell rang again. Dorian stepped inside, a dusting of snow on his shoulders. Their eyes met across the cafe's cozy chaos, the clink of cutlery, the hiss of the espresso machine, a Christmas tune playing faintly on the radio. Recognition jolted through her chest. He ordered coffee, then, as if casual, approached her table. Mind if I sit? His voice carried the same gravelly warmth she'd noticed at the supply store. She gestured to the empty chair. Sure. Small town can't exactly be territorial about seating. He smiled faintly. Dorian. I grew up around here. Been away a while. Elena tilted her head. You have that look like you know these mountains better than the rest of us. Maybe. He wrapped long fingers around his mug, watching steam rise. You work nights at the clinic? She nodded. And apparently collect strays. Last night was strange. She hesitated, then chuckled. I found a wolf. Big guy. Hurt. Stuck around long enough to let me stitch him up. Dorian's stomach nodded. He forced a non-committal sound. Wolves usually don't trust people. That's what I thought. But this one, she trailed off, studying his face as if searching for a clue. Something about him felt different. A beat of silence stretched, the cafe's noise receding around them. Dorian swallowed, willing his heartbeat to slow. Sounds like you're a good nurse. Or a fool, she said lightly, though her eyes softened. But sometimes you take a risk for what feels right. Her words struck deeper than she knew. He held her gaze, feeling the curse's weight and the possibility, wild and terrifying, that maybe fate had given him a chance to be more than a creature of the night. Outside, the snow thickened, spinning around Pine Hollow like a shaken snow globe. Inside the cafe, two lives, previously orbiting in separate worlds, began to thread themselves together beneath the watchful moon. The cafe's windows blurred with frost, a cocoon against the swirling snow outside. Dorian watched Elena cradle her tea, her fingers slender and sure, and felt the wolf inside him lean toward her warmth. She laughed quietly at something a passing waitress said, and the sound curled around him like a memory he didn't know he'd been missing. So, Elena said, glancing at him over the rim of her mug, "What brings you back to Pine Hollow?" "Not a lot of folks come here unless they're born here, or hiding from something." Her tone was light, teasing, but her eyes searched his face with genuine curiosity. He forced a small smile. "Guess I miss the mountains. Miss the quiet." It wasn't a total lie. What he didn't say, that quiet was safer for a cursed man who could never stay anywhere long. "And maybe I was looking for something I didn't know I'd lost." She tilted her head, intrigued. "That's poetic for a guy buying flour and coffee beans." "Must be the altitude." He sipped his drink to hide the flicker of amusement tugging at his lips. Their conversation ambled easily, small-town gossip, the upcoming winter festival, her stories of frantic late-night clinic runs. She asked about his work, and he cobbled together an answer about odd jobs and carpentry, careful to keep details vague. But when she talked about stargazing with her dad and the way she still sometimes whispers her worries to the constellations, something in him softened, cracked open. As the snowstorm deepened, the cafe's other customers trickled out. The waitress wiped down tables with a final flourish and called, "Closing up soon, folks." Elena glanced at the clock and sighed. "Guess that's our cue." They bundled into coats and stepped into the swirling snow. The wind knifed through the quiet streets, but walking beside her, Dorian felt a strange peace. Her shoulder brushed his arm as they crossed Main Street. Their breath plumed in shared clouds, ghostly in the lamplight. At her car, she hesitated, fumbling for her keys. "Hey," she said, voice softer than the falling flakes. "I'm glad we ran into each other again." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Me too." She opened her door, then paused. "You ever get the feeling?" She stopped, smiled at her own hesitation. "Never mind. See you around, Dorian." He watched her taillights fade into the storm, heart thrumming like a drumline. The wolf within him stirred restlessly, whispering what he couldn't admit aloud, that this accidental, impossible connection was already more than chance. Above, the moon slid behind a veil of clouds, but Dorian felt its pull all the same, a silent reminder of the secret pacing in his veins and the choice looming ever closer between distance and desire. The storm blanketed Pine Hollow overnight, muting the world to a hush of snow-laden branches and distant plow trucks grumbling awake. By evening, the roads were clear enough for the clinic to reopen, and Elena trudged through the slush with an unshakable sense that something was unfolding just beyond her understanding. All day she'd caught herself glancing toward the forest's edge, searching for a flicker of gray fur or the brush of familiar eyes. She was restocking bandages when the low growl of wind outside shifted, became layered with something sharper, wilder. A howl carried across town, long, mournful, and not entirely wolf. It prickled her skin and stirred a memory she shouldn't have. Elena stepped to the window. Through the snowy dark, she thought she saw movement, a shadow slipping between lampposts toward the woods. Too big for a dog. Too deliberate for a deer. Dorian had run farther than he meant to, the wolf in him hungry for distance and the clean bite of winter air. But the curse wasn't the only thing gnawing at him. He could smell them now, the rogues who'd attacked him days ago, prowling at Pine Hollow's edge. They were desperate enough to follow him here and reckless enough to threaten humans if cornered. The thought of Elena in their path tightened something inside him. He'd stayed away from people to protect them, but fate had twisted that plan. She already mattered. And if she was in danger because of him, He broke from the trees, paws kicking up powder, and made for the only light burning past midnight, the clinic. The side door rattled. Elena spun, heart racing. The wolf stepped in, his fur dusted with snow, his eyes blazing a warning. He paced, then stopped to stare at her with urgent intensity. "You're back," she breathed, then frowned at his agitation. "What's wrong?" He growled low, ears flicking toward the forest. The sound wasn't a threat, it was a plea. Somehow she understood. Danger was close. A crash outside confirmed it. A garbage bin toppled, claws scraping metal. Another howl answered from the trees. Elena's breath fogged as adrenaline spiked. The wolf nudged her hand toward the door, then moved to stand between her and the sound. She realized, with a shiver of awe and terror, that he wasn't just seeking her, he was protecting her. Two shapes emerged from the shadows outside, gaunt wolves, their eyes feverish, their coats ragged. Dorian bared his teeth, a deep snarl vibrating through the winter air. The rogues circled, hungry and reckless. Elena backed against the counter, her pulse hammering. Her mind raced. She was a nurse, not a fighter. But she spotted the heavy broom by the doorway, snatched it up, and planted her feet. The rogues lunged. Dorian met the first mid-leap, claws slashing, snow exploding beneath them. The second darted toward Elena, jaws snapping. She swung the broom hard, catching its muzzle enough to send it yelping and stumbling back. The clinic's fluorescent lights flickered under the chaos. Dorian's flank split again, stitches straining, but he pushed the rogue into a shelving unit with a forceful shove. Bottles crashed, alcohol and saline spilling across the floor. The wolves retreated finally, fading into the snow with angry howls. Panting, Dorian turned back to Elena. Her hands shook around the broom handle, but her eyes were fierce. "You saved me," she whispered. The wolf limped toward her, head lowered, eyes soft. And for the first time, she didn't feel crazy for speaking the truth that trembled on her lips. "I don't know what you are," she said, "but I trust you." Dorian's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her everything, that he was a man as much as a beast, that her belief was the first miracle he'd known in years. But the curse held his voice hostage until dawn. So he pressed his muzzle to her palm, hoping she could feel what words could not. Outside, the moon sailed on, bright and unblinking, as if to witness the fragile beginning of something powerful enough to break an old curse. Elena's fingers threaded instinctively through the thick fur at his neck, and the wildness of him, stole her breath. His warmth bled through her trembling hands, steadying them even as her adrenaline still surged. Shattered bottles glimmered across the clinic floor like fallen stars. "Sit," she said softly, not because she thought he understood words, but because it calmed her. The wolf obeyed anyway, lowering himself onto the tile with a grace that was all too deliberate. She fetched gauze and saline, wiping away streaks of blood and alcohol from his reopened wound. The edges of her fear softened as she worked. Her voice slipped into that gentle cadence reserved for patients. "You're unbelievable. You take on 2 wolves, then show up for round 2 like it's a routine checkup." His golden eyes never left her face. By the time she'd replaced the bandage and mopped up the mess, the clock ticked past 4 a.m. Exhaustion pressed at her temples. But the thought of leaving him, of waking to find paw prints and silence again, made her chest ache. "Stay," she whispered. "Just stay until morning." She pulled a thin blanket from the supply closet and curled up on the exam room bench. The wolf stretched on the floor beside her, close enough that his steady breathing lulled her into a fragile sleep. The first hint of dawn crept through the blinds. Dorian woke with a jolt, his body already shuddering under the curse's pull. He watched her sleep, lashes resting against her cheeks, the faintest smile softening her mouth even in dreams. The knowledge that she had trusted him enough to fall asleep beside a predator sent a raw ache through him. He slipped silently from the clinic, paws padding through the fresh snow. By the time sunlight touched the horizon, bones cracked and fur receded, and Dorian crouched naked in the pines once more. He dressed quickly, wiping blood and snow from his hands, and let himself breathe, one breath for survival, one for the hope growing in him despite every warning. Later that morning, Elena woke to find the wolf gone. Again. But this time, the air didn't feel empty, it felt expectant. She drove into town after her shift, craving fresh air and maybe a sense of normalcy. At the cafe, she ordered her usual tea and settled at a corner table. When the bell chimed, she glanced up without expectation and nearly spilled her drink. Dorian stepped through the door, flannel shirt dusted with melting snow, eyes a stormy gray that rooted her to the spot. He ordered coffee, then spotted her and hesitated. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might leave. But then he crossed the room and nodded toward the seat across from her. "Mind if I join you?" Her pulse quickened. She forced a casual shrug. "Sure. Small town, right?" As he sat, the cafe's warmth wrapped around them. Outside, Pine Hollow's streets lay pristine under the winter sun. Inside, Elena felt the strangest sensation, that the pieces of her world were quietly rearranging, aligning toward something extraordinary she wasn't ready to name. She studied his face, that flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "You look like you've had a rough couple of nights." Dorian's lips curved into the smallest wry smile. "You could say that." Somewhere deep in her chest, a recognition stirred, subtle, undeniable, and terrifyingly sweet. The bond between them was no longer just a chance encounter. It was a promise beginning to take shape, even if neither dared speak it aloud. The cafe's warmth and the faint strains of an old love song on the radio felt too intimate for a casual morning chat. Elena tucked her hair behind her ear, searching for something safe to say, but the man across from her seemed carved from the same quiet that had filled the clinic last night. "You're not from here," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Not really." Dorian's fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup. "I was, once. Left a long time ago." He hesitated, then added, "Some things you can't outrun forever." There was a shadow in his voice that made her chest tighten. She wanted to ask, "What are you running from?" But instead she said, "Well, Pine Hollow isn't exactly known for its nightlife, but it has good tea." A chuckle escaped him. Low, rough, genuine. The sound tugged at something deep inside her. They talked about ordinary things, the best place for pie in town, the clinic's broken furnace, the way snow muffled the world into a kind of magic. But under their words, another conversation pulsed unspoken, the way his gaze lingered on her mouth, the way she felt oddly safe beside him. When they stepped outside, the storm had eased. Sunlight flashed off icicles, scattering diamonds across Main Street. Dorian walked her to her car. For a heartbeat too long, they stood there, breath clouding the crisp air. "Thanks for the company," Elena said. "Anytime." His voice was soft, but something fierce flickered in his eyes, quickly hidden. She slid into her car, but when she glanced back in the rearview mirror, he was still standing there in the snow, watching her go. That night, Elena's dreams were a tapestry of silver fur and gray eyes. She woke tangled in her sheets, the echo of a howl fading from her mind. At work, she found herself glancing at the clinic door whenever the wind groaned through the pines. Her coworkers teased her for spacing out, and she laughed it off, but deep down she was certain the wolf would return. Dorian spent the day strengthening his cabin's barricades, sharpening old silver-tipped arrows, and scanning the forest for rogue tracks. He'd scented them again, closer now, testing the town's edges. The curse was one thing, but rogues hungry enough to attack near humans could unravel everything. As the sun sank, dread and longing warred inside him. He should stay away. He should run farther into the mountains, draw the danger with him. But the thought of Elena facing the night without him tightened his chest. When the shift took him, bones reshaping, for bursting forth, he didn't fight it. The wolf bolted down the mountain path toward the clinic, moonlight glinting off his silver coat. Elena was restocking shelves when she heard the soft scrape of claws on pavement. She froze, heart leaping. The side door creaked open under a nudge, and there he was, a living shadow stepping from the storm, golden eyes fixed on her like she was the only thing tethering him to the world. She knelt, hand trembling as she held it out. I was starting to think you were a dream, she whispered. The wolf pressed his head into her palm, and Elena's chest filled with something that felt like relief and wonder braided together. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. Inside, beneath sterile lights and the hum of the radiator, a bond deepened, something older than curses or fear, growing stronger with every shared heartbeat. The clinic seemed smaller that night, its sterile walls softened by the hush of falling snow. Elena pulled a stool close, the wolf settling beside her like an anchor. She felt the pulse of his heartbeat through her palm as she stroked his fur, a steady rhythm that made the chaos of the outside world fade. You always pick the perfect nights to visit, she murmured, her voice low. Like you know when I'm about to lose faith in small miracles. The wolf's ears twitched at her words. He couldn't tell her he knew it in the scent of her skin, the weight of her gaze, but he could stay, and sometimes staying was enough. They sat together while the hours bled away. Elena found herself sharing fragments of her past she rarely voiced aloud, the scholarship she'd turned down because her father was too sick to manage alone, the way she sometimes imagined herself in another life, one where she wasn't tethered to the night shift, where she could travel, chase stars, maybe even love without caution. The wolf shifted closer, his golden eyes holding hers until the ache in her chest eased. For a moment, she leaned her forehead against his, eyes closed. You're dangerous, she whispered, not as an accusation, but as a confession of how easily her heart leaned toward him. A sudden sound, branches cracking outside, snapped the spell. The wolf's head jerked toward the window, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elena tensed, gripping the edge of the counter. Two shadows slipped past the frosted glass. Rogues. They had followed him again. The wolf bolted for the door, muscles bunching, claws clicking on tile. Elena's pulse thundered, but she grabbed the broom from last night and followed. Outside, the parking lot was a silver-lit battlefield of snowdrifts and moonlight. The two gaunt wolves stalked forward, their eyes feral and hungry. Dorian, trapped in wolf form, placed himself between Elena and the intruders, his own wound still tender but forgotten in the face of threat. He bared his teeth in a snarl that carried promise, not her. Never her. The rogues lunged. Snow exploded beneath their paws as Dorian met the first midair, slamming it onto its side. The second veered toward Elena. She swung the broom like a staff, catching it across the muzzle again, but it circled, angling for another attack. Dorian dispatched his opponent with a vicious shove and a bite that sent it yelping into the dark. He turned just as the second rogue leapt for Elena. With a roar that seemed to crack the night itself, he collided with the attacker mid-spring, sending them both tumbling into a snowbank. The rogue scrambled away, retreating into the trees, its howl fading into the distance. Breathing hard, Dorian limped back to Elena. She still clutched the broom, her knuckles white. Snowflakes clung to her lashes, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. "Hey," she whispered, lowering the broom. "You saved me. Again." The wolf stepped closer, his head lowering in a gesture so vulnerable it stole her words. She dropped to her knees in the snow, cupping his face between her trembling hands. For a moment, under the indifferent gaze of the moon, the world felt impossibly small, just a woman and a cursed man in borrowed skin, bound by something bigger than either of them dared name. The moonlight scattered across the snow like shattered glass as Elena held the wolf's face in her palms. His fur was warm beneath her fingers, his breath fogging the frigid air. Her heart still hammered from the attack, but an even sharper awareness pressed in, the steady weight of his gaze, as if he were trying to speak through gold-tinted eyes. She swallowed hard. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered. "But I'm not afraid of you." The wolf pressed his forehead lightly to hers, just for a heartbeat, before stepping back. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, the reopened wound bleeding faintly. He limped toward the clinic door, glancing over his shoulder once to make sure she followed. She did, her boots crunching in the snow. Inside, the radiator hissed and fluorescent lights buzzed like drowsy insects. Elena cleaned his wound again, her movements sure even as her thoughts spiraled. She should be terrified. Rational people didn't befriend predators. But the world had shifted. Ordinary rules felt brittle in the wake of what she'd seen. She spoke while she worked, the words tumbling out because silence was unbearable. You knew they'd come, didn't you? You could have stayed away, but you came back anyway. The wolf's ears flicked. She could almost imagine him answering. When she'd finished the bandage, she sank into the stool, suddenly bone-tired. I don't know why I feel safer with you here, she admitted. But I do. She stayed awake until the first gray light of dawn crept across the blinds, unwilling to miss the moment he disappeared. But her eyelids betrayed her, drooping in the last quiet hour before sunrise. The shift ripped through Dorian like fire, dragging him out of fur and bone and back into fragile humanity. He crouched behind the clinic, breath steaming, snow biting at his bare feet. He stared at the door, aching to go back inside as himself, to tell her the truth, to thank her, to hold the hand that had mended him. But the curse's shame was heavy. If she saw what he really was, would her trust vanish? He slipped into the forest, pulled on the spare clothes stashed beneath a fallen log, and trudged back to his cabin with a heart that felt heavier than the mountain snow. Elena woke alone, the bandaged wolf gone again. She wasn't surprised, but disappointment still tugged at her ribs. She cleaned up the exam room and tried to tell herself it was for the best. But as she stalked the shelves, she found herself humming under her breath, soft, tuneless, but hopeful. Later, at the grocery store, she spotted Dorian near the produce section, inspecting apples. For an instant her breath caught. There was something in the angle of his shoulders, the quiet grace of his movements that mirrored the wolf. She approached, pulse quickening. You again, she said, attempting casual. He turned, and for a heartbeat, their eyes locked. A flicker of recognition passed between them, too quick for certainty, too deep to dismiss. Small town, he said lightly, but his voice held an edge she couldn't name. She smiled despite herself. You always seem to show up when I'm in need of a good distraction. Dorian's lips curved faintly, though the weight of unspoken truths shadowed his gaze. Guess I've got good timing. Outside, Pine Hollow basked in brittle winter sunlight. Inside, two hearts circled closer, unaware that the next choice they made would decide the fate of them both and the curse that bound him to the night. The groceries heater rattled above them, a brittle hum underscoring the quiet pull between them. Dorian handed her a bag of apples she hadn't realized she'd dropped, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. He darted up her arm at the touch, impossible for something so small. You've got a habit of showing up when I least expect it, Elena said, aiming for playful, but landing somewhere closer to breathless. Dorian's storm-gray eyes softened. Maybe I just like surprises. She wanted to ask, are you the wolf? But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded toward the cashier. Guess I'll see you around. As she left, Dorian watched her go, his wolf senses cataloging every detail, the lavender soap clinging to her scarf, the way her boots crunched on salt-scattered tile. Each fragment anchored him more tightly to the life he could never fully claim. That evening, Pine Hollow glowed with twinkling festival lights strung across Main Street. The winter carnival, the only real excitement for miles, had drawn townsfolk bundled in scarves and mittens, music spilling from speakers as kids lined up for cocoa. Elena stood near a booth selling carved ornaments, the cold reddening her cheeks. She hadn't meant to linger, but something about the crisp air and the laughter softened her. She spotted Dorian across the square, helping an older man lift a heavy box onto a truck bed. His easy strength, the casual kindness, it sent a rush of warmth through her. He noticed her then, and the look they shared over the crowd felt like its own secret language. He crossed to her through the milling festival-goers. Didn't expect to see you here, he said. She shrugged. Needed a reminder that winter can be beautiful, not just bitter. They walked together past the glowing stalls. Elena pointed out her favorite constellation, a faint smear of stars above the carnival lights. Orion, she said. My dad taught me all their names. Said the sky could keep your secrets if you needed somewhere to hide them. Dorian tilted his head back to follow her gaze. Maybe that's why I like it here, he murmured. The stars don't ask questions. The words hovered between them, fragile as frost. Elena's chest tightened. She sensed the weight he carried, the loneliness stitched into his silences. A gust of wind swept through, rattling the strings of lights. Dorian noticed a pair of hunters at the festival's edge, their voices too casual, their scent unmistakably wolfish. His muscles coiled. The rogues were still near, and Pine Hollow was full of unsuspecting people. "Elena," he said quietly, urgency threading his tone, "stay close tonight." She blinked at him, puzzled. "What's wrong?" "Just trust me." His gaze held hers for a heartbeat too long, and despite not knowing why, she believed him. Together, they melted into the festival crowd, the night around them thrumming with distant howls and the unspoken promise of what was coming. The winter carnival's music faltered as a howl rolled over Pine Hollow, low and jagged, too close. Dorian's chest tightened. The rogues were no longer testing boundaries, they were inside them. He gripped Elena's arm lightly but firmly and steered her toward a quieter alley behind the cocoa stand. "Dorian, what's going on?" she whispered, breath fogging in the cold. Another howl split the night, followed by a crash, a tipped-over vendor table, screams, the frantic shuffle of boots on ice. Dorian's jaw clenched. He couldn't hide anymore, not from her, not from himself. "Elena," he said, voice raw, "you're about to see something I never wanted you to see." Before she could ask, his body convulsed under the moonlight. Bones cracked, muscles stretched, fur exploded across his skin. In seconds, the man she'd been falling for stood replaced by the great silver-gray wolf she had mended beneath sterile lights. Golden eyes, his eyes, locked on hers. Her gasp caught in her throat, but she didn't back away. She stepped forward, trembling. "It's you," she breathed. "It was always you." A rogue lunged from the shadows, gaunt, feral, teeth flashing. Dorian met it head-on, their bodies colliding in a spray of snow. Another rogue circled, snarling. Elena, heart hammering, grabbed a fallen metal signpost and swung it, deflecting the beast just enough for Dorian to clamp his jaws around its flank and hurl it aside. The rogues, bloodied and outmatched, retreated into the trees, their howls fading into the mountain night. The square was chaos, people shouting, vendors gathering their children, but no one had seen clearly in the snow and shadows. Dorian shifted back as soon as the rogues disappeared, crouching behind a parked truck. Elena's hands shook as she rushed to him, averting her eyes until he pulled on his jeans. She knelt beside him. You're a shifter." "I was cursed," he said, voice rough, breath steaming. "A witch's vengeance. After sunset, I'm trapped in wolf form until dawn. I didn't want to drag anyone else into it. But the rogues followed me here. I couldn't let them hurt you." She touched his cheek, her own fear tempered by something fiercer. "You idiot," she said, a broken laugh escaping her. "You thought I'd hate you for saving me?" His gray eyes softened. "I thought you'd run. I'm still here." He pressed his forehead to hers, a quiet, grateful gesture. And beneath the carnival lights and the winter stars, something inside the curse began to crack. The magic that had held him bound for years loosened its grip, sensing a force older and stronger, love freely chosen. By sunrise, Pine Hollow's streets were still again. The townsfolk dismissed the howls as coyotes and wind. Dorian and Elena walked side by side through the forest, snow crunching underfoot. He stopped beneath a canopy of bare branches, moonlight's echo still lingering. "It feels different," he said. "Like the curse doesn't have claws anymore." Elena smiled, slipping her gloved hand into his. "Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just needed a little honesty." He exhaled a laugh, the first unguarded sound he'd made in years. "You make me believe in impossible things." She squeezed his hand. "The impossible isn't so scary when you're not facing it alone." Epilogue, months later. Spring sunlight bathed Pine Hollow's hills in green. At the forest's edge, Elena leaned against Dorian's truck, watching as a silver-gray wolf trotted toward her, his fur gleaming in the late afternoon light. Halfway across the clearing, he shimmered and shifted, the man emerging with an easy smile. He pulled her into his arms. Still not tired of my dramatic entrances? She laughed, pressing a kiss to his jaw. Never. They walked together toward the town, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. The curse was broken, the rogues scattered, and Pine Hollow's nights were no longer haunted by lonely howls. But sometimes, when the moon rose high and silver, a wolf song still drifted over the hills, less a lament now than a promise kept. Under the starlit sky, Elena and Dorian moved forward, partners in both the daylight and the dark, their bond stronger than any curse and brighter than the moon itself. Break time equals 0. 5s/. The end. Thank you for listening. If you liked this, check out our other stories. Epilogue, months later. Spring sunlight bathed Pine Hollow's hills in green. At the forest's edge, Elena leaned against Dorian's truck, watching as a silver-gray wolf trotted toward her, his fur gleaming in the late afternoon light. Halfway across the clearing, he shimmered and shifted, the man emerging with an easy smile. He pulled her into his arms. Still not tired of my dramatic entrances? She laughed, pressing a kiss to his jaw. Never. They walked together toward the town, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. The curse was broken, the rogues scattered, and Pine Hollow's nights were no longer haunted by lonely howls. But sometimes, when the moon rose high and silver, a wolf song still drifted over the hills, less a lament now than a promise kept. Under the starlit sky, Elena and Dorian moved forward, partners in both the daylight and the dark, their bond stronger than any curse and brighter than the moon itself. Break time equals 0. 5s/. The end. Thank you for listening. If you liked this, check out our other stories.